Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka Uber Bear, and I'm joined by my other host this evening,
Christian.
Welcome back to the show, Christian. So we have an interesting dilemma that I have been approached by with multiple, we're going to call them muggles, no-mages, or those people that simply don't understand the game. And they're like, Anthony, we love your podcast, but we have no idea what you're talking about. What is cube? ? Well, before we get into that topic, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. Christian, what are you having this evening?
I am having a Red Oak Bavarian Amber Ale.
I, too, am having the same. It's a local, so it's good stuff. We know it's tried and true. Not over the top, just a simple beer. Here we go. Let's pop them open and see what we got to talk about. All right. That's tasty. All right. So, as I said before, it was brought to my attention this evening. We're at a local gathering, and had a good friend of ours, and she goes, Anthony, your podcast sounds fun. I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'm like, well, it's cube. It's cube. It's cube. And she's like staring at me, and she's like, cube what? Cube what? Cube with 3 times squared, what, etc. Right? So I did my very best to navigate this question. And I said, well, it's a compilation of magic cards that I've put inside of a box where I've built a story.
So, Anthony, what actually is a cube?
Well, to answer that, so this has been a thought process that has evolved over time. And the idea behind this episode is to explain it from a point of view that makes it more entry point, less intimidating, because you got new people. And I hate to use the term muggles and no-mages, because this is more to the enfranchised Magic the Gathering players. But maybe they've heard within, I don't know, their LGS or in their commander circle, hey, anybody interested in playing cube? ? Right? Do you want to play cube? What is cube? And sometimes I feel like as a community, myself included with this idea, we promote it in such a structured way. It's almost like we're putting our own, our pillars and our stances within it that it can make it so intimidating, so daunting, that it seems like there's no way to enter this idea. Oh, you have to be a podcaster. You have to have a YouTube channel. You have to have something that's been featured in something in order to build a cube. Well, that's simply not true. Christian, would you agree with that?
100%. Like, cubes, they can come in all different varieties and shapes and sizes, if you want to go that way. If you just want to throw together a pile of cards, that is, fine. And you could make a cube out of that. But we're going to talk about what we generally like to do around here and make more thematic cubes and stuff like that. And if you don't want to go that deep into it right out of the gate, that's fine. But we'll discuss all that.
Yeah, so we're not going to develop the monolith or the sovereign nation of cube idea, right? We want this to be an entry point, so it's less intimidating. And a lot of times the structure that's oftentimes projected, I'll make myself a guilty party in this, right? It can be frightening. Like, hey, I want to build a cube, but I want it to be right the first time. And what I'll tell you from someone who owns 6 cubes, it's simply not going to be right the first time. They're basically living game systems, right? Yeah. And you're never going to get it right. No matter how much you try to build that perfect La Femme Fatale cube to release on a Friday night for your buddies to play with on that evening, there's always going to be minor flaws and tweaks. And that's going to continue and continue. And the ultimate idea within the cube, the game system, is to build one that it's completely assembled around the idea of fun. Now, I realize that fun is a subjective idea, right? And so you have to kind of form this to your play group, right? And in that idea, that gets really difficult for a curator. How do I target the fun within my 8 to 12 players? We'll even say 4 players, right? How do I manage this complexity of hitting all these targets, all these marks, to ensure that everyone has a wonderful experience? People walk away and like, oh man, I really want to play that again. Christian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's going to be a hard thing to do sometimes, and you just got to take that player input sometimes and try to always, like you said, it's a living cube. 100% never going to get it right on the first time, and that's okay. And it doesn't have to be exactly what all of your players want, but it's just, you want it to be something that's fun that people want to play.
Well, then that kind of poses the question again that I asked in the beginning. Anthony and Christian, what is a cube? Well, I'm going to tell you this. It is a box of cards, and it doesn't matter what the game system is. It can be Pokemon. It can be Yu-Gi-Oh! It can be Star Wars. It could be Flesh and Blood.
Yes.
It's just literally you have chosen certain specific cards to represent and tell a story or a game system. Now, that's a daunting task. So imagine yourself playing a game of Monopoly. I'm going to go back to the way back when I first learned how to play Monopoly.
Love that game.
I love that game as well. But not everyone may agree with that. Yeah. But if you follow the actual game, you follow the rules, you're going to find out that the free play area, for example, is simply that. It is a space in which you can land on that has no cause and effect. However, I was taught that's where all the taxes went. Every time a player had to pay the bank, it went there. And what this actually caused in the game of Monopoly was this overwhelming economy that one person, through the luck of the roll of the dice, would land on this space, and suddenly they have an entire advantage on their economy system. They could build hotels and buy additional properties. Well, let's say they've got an additional $1,200 that the rest of the table doesn't have. It kind of broke the game. So in that creates the challenge of game design, and that is in my personal opinion, that is the daunting entry point or the over exemplified entry point for building a cube, because you think it has to be perfect. It doesn't. It's going to have rough edges. However, there are ideals. There is a system in place, and there's a lot of podcasts out there and YouTube channels that can help you with designing a cube for the first time to give you that entry point. For example, Cultic Cube has an amazing entry point into cube, has a video specifically designed around that. Lucky Paper Radio has a specific entry point podcast within their system that will explain to you how to build a cube and what it means. And there's Cube and Chaos has one. And there's other podcasts that'll give you ways in, entry points like, where do I start? How do I develop a cube? What are archetypes, etc.? But before you do that, you have to have a fundamental understanding of what does it even mean to you, right? Like, as a commander player, and that's where I feel like I started, I needed to have when I first started playing cube, my buddy Chris, and he built one, there's a couple of problems that may or may not have occurred. One was I just built a new commander deck, and I was commander deck of the week, right? You're always trying to make this poppin' fresh, great commander deck. Well, I'd show up, and Chris would say, like, "Hey guys, you want to play cube?" Well, I had no dog in the race. I had it had no emotional experience for me. I didn't have anything to compare it to. And while I do enjoy drafting at my local LGS on occasions, it just wasn't something I was doing all the time. I like the constructed play of a commander deck. However, once I started realizing I had the liberty and that the gamer neutrality, that didn't matter how truly skilled you were, that if you had an entry point and you started cubing and you drafted, everyone had a chance to play the game really well. Now, I realize there's variance that's embedded in there, player skill testing, etc. It all experience, lines of play. You can't deny that. However, it wasn't about, Anthony has a powerful deck he's built in Commander, and it's just romple-stomping everyone at the table, and no one wants to play against it, and then he builds another one. Cube was the great equalizer, in my opinion. Do you have anything to say about that, Christian?
Yeah, I mean, and that is one of the defining factors of Cube. It's like everybody is on the same playing field. You're all drafting from that same pool of cards. Then based on like your knowledge of like that cube, and then like what you can do with that. And if you got a good cube curator, they'll like guide you and give you information on like, the archetypes and all that, so you can build a better deck when you're drafting.
Yeah, so it kind of bodes the question. We kind of went with what's the cube? And I'm going to say cube is a box of cards from a particular subset of a game, right? We've extrapolated pieces of a game, and we've decided to make another game as a kind of an equivalent, but it's ancillary to the actual main game. So if I did, and I'm not familiar with Flesh and Blood, but if I took subsets of it and I played from it, and or Pokemon, and I decided to build a Pokemon cube, I would choose and basically cherry pick specific cards that kind of meet the requirements of what my vision is, of what my game system is. There's no perfection to this idea, but that's how I would take it on.
Yeah, and so for my Bant Enchantment Cube, I basically just took one of my ADH decks and had that as like the starting jumping off point to create that cube. That was kind of like the basis, and then like I built up from there to kind of create my Bant Enchantment Cube.
So you would say that you took a point of familiarity where he was familiar with how the mechanics within that certain game system of that commander deck worked, and he had a comfort level with it. We're going to call that, that warm bowl of chili on a winter morning.
Right.
And so he felt confident enough to be able to, I think I can expand this idea into a game system. So that's kind of where you start. So for example, and I've talked about this before, so I have 6 cubes, possibly 7, but 6 cubes. And in truth, of all the cubes that I have developed, the one that it's my least favorite, almost comedic at this point, is my powered vintage cube. And because it doesn't represent my ideas, it's a clone of a lot of the same. It's almost more of the same, right? There are expectations that are pressed upon you, like a powered vintage cube should look like, X, Y, and Z. However, I've kind of branched off into thematic cube design. So any idea that pops into my mind, I'm going to be like, what can I do to build an idea around this? For example, as an idea, I'm like, I want to build a cube. I wanted to build something that's factional based. I like werewolves. I think they're great. I like zombies. I think they're pretty neat. I like vampires. You know what I think I could build? A very Lovecraftian, not to remove that guy's a jerk, or a Clive Barker type sense, Stephen King, etc. I can build an entire world where there's scary creatures in it. So what do I start with? So I'm going to go start getting all my binders and like, how many vampires do I have? How many werewolves do I have? How many spirits? How many humans, etc. And then which of those actually fit my design expectations? I want them to be scary, but I also want them to feel Innistrad-esque, Gothic horror-esque, or to branch off even further. One day pops in my mind, hey, I want to build an entire cube that celebrates the females in the Magic multiverse. Well, how would I do that? Let's use Scryfall, for example. And other tools like the Gatherer, etc. And I'm going to look for everything that has an art that has a female in it, and then decide, does that from 40,000 feet fall within a spectrum? We talked about using this before, a Venn diagram of the paper, rock, scissors idea of cube, where I was using aggro, mid-range control, and where do these game pieces fall into my vision before I've even introduced them to my play group. So the entry point was completely just compartmentalized within my design space. The world has not seen it. Does that make sense, Christian?
I would 100% agree. I had a similar experience recently where I just saw a comment on Twitter and there was like a cube with like a cat face on it. And then it was like, oh, cat cube? And I was like, you know what? I have a cat equipment deck. I want to build a Naya cat equipment deck. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to go with that idea and try to build a cube.
So let's kind of make this a little bit more clean. So you have the idea, right? So you're the artist. So Christian says, I like cats. And he has familiarity with Commander, and he has particular cat, decks, etc. And in addition to, I said, I want to build a cube that celebrates females in the Magic multiverse. Well, okay, so sure, we've got that idea. So now you got to ask yourself a few key questions. How many people are going to play this cube? That's pretty fundamental, right? So what am I looking at for my group in context of that are going to sit down, and not only that, they're going to want to draft this. So I said to myself, what's a comfortable number? No, that varies wildly. It could be 180 if you have 4 players, or even supports 2 players, right? Or you could have 360, or you can have 540, or you can have, I can just keep going, 720, or this number can be completely customized. And all it has to do is the typical draft of 3 packs of 15 per player sitting at a table. How many do you want to support? But you can also maximize that based on what type of genre or what type of draft system you want to use. And there's a whole bunch of them. There's Winston and Pancake and Houseman, etc. Or you want to do a standard draft. It doesn't matter. You tailor the format, the game of your players, right? So that's kind of your starting point. So you have your vision and you have how many players do I want to see this vision. Okay, so now that we have kind of what is a cube is a box of cards from a subset of another game. And that can be defined by, we use in our examples, it could be Magic the Gathering, it can be Flesh and Blood, it can be Pokemon, and we'll just throw in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm not going to pretend that I'm familiar with these game systems. I'm just saying that a curator can choose to, quote unquote, cherry pick certain cards that represent certain ideals that fits their vision of the story they want to tell. So I use something more real. We talked about something kind of, in my opinion, that was real world. Christian said he wanted to build a cat deck, and he had familiarity with the idea of his commander decks, so he could basically extrapolate or pull pieces from them to expand the world, the storytelling. And we've even talked about it like cats versus dogs, cats versus rats, cats versus dogs and rats. And you can see where if you were using the Magic game system, you could choose certain portions of the color wheel to represent those. And then you now, for your next step, we talked about how many players I'm going to represent. How big does this game need to be, right? Am I going to do my traditional, we're going to use the Monopoly idea. How many pieces on the board do I need to have on the board, right? That's important. Because that's how you're going to tailor your game system to come into it. And this doesn't have to be perfect. Again, this can be as simple as the box O cards. Now, there are flaws to that. And I will give my personal experience. And I talked about this during our Popper episode where Chris Moore, a.k.a. Sandwich, and I sat around and talked about the Popper. And we made jokes about my box O cards cube, where basically I just took, if it had common on it, I put it in a box. Well, there are fallacies in that idea. Because with every game system, players have expectations of not only replayability, but also functionality within said game, right? And that does create a challenge. It makes it daunting for a new player to go, I want to build a cube. I don't want them to judge me. I want this to be perfect the first time. I assure you that all of these game systems, to include the game of Monopoly that's been around forever, went through multiple iterations in order to get it to the system that we're dealing with today. Although it has imperfections and it's well known at this point, it has been accepted. It's just part of the culture. It takes testing and revolutions and evolutions of a game to make it good. So my advice as a curator and as a podcaster is to get your favorite idea, come up with it, brainstorm and go, I want to build a deck that's purely based off of football teams. And it's going to be the Vikings versus the Falcons. And it can be that simple. And then how do I make a game system match that? I'm going to take cards now. I'm going to go into Scryfall, which is an amazing tool. And I'm going to look at cards that are bird-like. I'm going to find ones that are Viking-like. And then, because it's my favorite football teams. And I want them to play in the Super Bowl. And I know that's absurd what I'm saying. And now you start assembling the pieces and you start picking out the cards. Now, this is when the next step comes online. And that's going to be, well, how do I divide them into archetypes? What are their function going to be in the cube? Aside from meeting my design idea from a 40,000, yes, this is a bird. Yes, this is a Viking. Where do you go from that?
The next step is you want to have player interaction of some sort. So you're going to have to think about how people are going to interact with the cards that you're putting in there. You want to have players to have some kind of agency to actually play the game, be interactive. Look at the breakup. How are the players going to play your Vikings? How are the players going to play the birds?
So we do that through archetype design. And archetype's another term that gets loosely used. So let's go 40,000 feet in the air. Follow me up in this. We're going up into the clouds. So we kind of did the paper, rock, scissors discussion we talked about before. And I do realize there's imperfections in it. Let's do aggro versus mid-range versus control. And then we'll put as a side idea, we'll put synergies and combos. But we're going to try to take these Vikings and birds that we've put within this cube idea that we're throwing out to the universe right now. I know it's absurd, Vikings versus Falcons, but we're gonna have some fun right here, right?
It can be done.
And how the brainstorming happens. I'm gonna say one of my Falcons is going to be, and I know there's better Falcons, but we're going to do Stormcrow, right? It's a silly card. I do love it. And then we're going to do for our Vikings, we're going to do Havlar from Kaldheim, right?
Yeah.
We're going to represent some Vikings, right? And this is going to be the cube design. So these are two pieces that we're now moving into the idea. Well, we don't even know where they're going to represent. What are they going to even mean to the cube, the game design? And that's where the complexity comes in. Where do we put these in the Venn diagram, in the placement of, are they, and let's go basic, let's go back into the clouds. It's going to be, is this an aggro card? Or is this a mid-range card? Or is this a control card? It's a good place to start. There's imperfections of that, or is it a combo piece? And you kind of just put them in their place, right? And you kind of put them on the diagram. And as I've talked about on the other episodes, Stu and I were discussing this. We're talking about an amazing tool. Before you've even put pen to paper, spent a dime, ordered your parts and pieces, you go on to Cube Cobra and you start theory crafting this idea. You just start typing down these cards and go, yeah, Stormcrow. Okay, cool. We'll just put that in. I don't care about the art. We'll say Portal. Sure. And then we're going to do Havlar. Okay, yeah, let's put that in there. We'll add it to my list. And then we start building out this world, and it's happening right in front of you. And once you have this fully developed, these cards, you can then share within your friend circle without any judgment-free zone, right? Kind of like Planet Fitness. It's going to be the judgment-free zone.
Right.
You know, hey peeps, I built this idea. I think it's neat. You want to give it some drafts. You guys want to try this out and see if you can actually form some archetypes. Because at this point, you don't even have to, as a curator, and that's a fancy word for, I'm a person that owns a box of cards at the end of the day. Right. Doesn't matter what play system it's from. We're going to be fancy. We're going to be curators. It makes me sound cool when I'm trying to tell people what I do. But at the end of the day, I got a bunch of cards. They're in a box. They got sleeves on them.
Right.
Let's go brass tack. Let's go brass tacks. It's right.
You know.
And so we're going to go the judgment-free zone and go, hey, Christian, I built this game system. You don't necessarily have to, as the quote-unquote curator, derive what the archetypes are. You can ask your friend circle to go, hey, I put these cards together. What do you see? And maybe Chris and Christian and Stu will go, oh, man, this is a pretty aggressive creature. And you're like, oh, yeah. I knew that the whole time, right?
Yeah.
So you mark that as aggro suite. And that seems a little controlling in here. You've put some kind of counter magic in here. That seems good. I think that's control suite. So it may seem daunting to use these fancy terms of curator, the person that owns a box of cards. Right? And it may seem daunting as, oh, man, I'm going to take a whole bunch of cards and put them in a box, and I'm going to present them to my group, and I hope they love me. But the reality is, before you even do that, you can just present it in a digital format and go, hey, what do you guys think about this? You want to try this out on Friday night without spending a dime. And that's the takeaway here, right? Without even developing archetypes. Now, that being said, you can start moving the pieces and go, all right, I think this is my mid-range suite. It's a werewolf and it's pretty big and it's a 4/4. And then I think this is a 2/2 for 1, whatever, Ishmaru, etc. I'm going to drop this in my aggro suite. You can start moving those cogs and moving them around. But the reality is, entry point, Muggle stance, you don't have to do all this. That's just adding complexity to the idea of putting a bunch of really neat, your favorite cards into a box, sleeving them up. You don't even have to sleeve them up. By the way, I'm throwing that out there just to protect the cards. We can brass tack some more. I'm all about protecting my cards. I've got a lot of cards here in we're going to call it the UberCube office. But the reality is that at the end of the day, you can have a Ziploc bag and take these to a pub, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on any of these ideas I've said so far, Christian?
So, yeah, you could go with pretty much any of the Vikings from, like, Kaldheim. And what you have to then decide is how powerful or what your power level that you want to set for this is. Are you going to include something like a very powerful card like Havlar in there, or some basic generic berserkers? And that will really set the tone for your cube, what power level you're going with.
Yeah, so ceilings and floors is what Christian is referring to. You've built this game. We now know it's bird and Viking based. Again, we're doing the chuckles here at UberCube.
Right.
But now we want to know we want to tailor this from Magic's history. We're going to do a Magic the Gathering cube in this case. We're going to cherry pick cards. How strong do we want them to be? What is going to be our most powerful card? What is going to be our weakest card? And what we're going to use is our benchmarks or our pillars to design our idea. Stormcrow being laughably, unfortunately, a not so great card, but is it going to be our benchmark for our lowest tier, or is it going to be the benchmark for our ceiling, our floor, or our ceiling, right? And that's a question mark you use. Like, what do you want this game to look like for your players? So that kind of brings the 40,000 foot design. So to recap, what we have covered so far is, what is a cube? It is a box of cards derived from a game, and like we said, it doesn't have to be Magic the Gathering. That just happens to be what we focus on here at UberCube. Then you cherry pick cards to tell your story, which we develop as curators, and we go, hey, I want to make a cube that's Star Wars-esque. I want cards that represent a hypothetical Darth Vader or a Sith, etc. What cards do I pick from that genre that pictorially maybe represent that bad guy, that big bad?
Right. And it doesn't even, this is like talking about mainly like theme cubes. You can also just go based off of like a power level. Do you want to do Popper? And all that, is much more, can be much more high level, but still it's something that you can consider.
And another simple entry point is, and we've talked about this before, is you can clone someone else's cube, right? Some of these riddles have already been solved. Like, if you don't want to put this much mental investment into this entry point, a good starting space is the Popper environment based on the cost analysis of those for about $100 retail, give or take. Referencing our Cube Essentials in addition to our Popper episode, you will pretty much could put one together for a very reasonable cost point. And I assure you, as a curator, that's a good entry point, but also maybe an entry point into start building more cubes. But those models and molds have already built. Sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Just go with that. And then that will give you the spark.
I like that term, spark. That's a good point. The whole idea behind this episode is to make the cube, to build a cube less, I guess, daunting, less intimidating. Sometimes myself and others will make these seem so systematic, so methodical, so math-based, so archetypical, that when you start throwing these terms out, it makes it not so introductory, that people don't want to do it. Why would I want to build this thing if I feel like others have already built it, crafted it, bigger, better, faster, right? That's a scary takeoff point. But when I'm telling you from personal experiences, have at it. Go against the grain a little bit and build yourself a cube. It is the gift that will keep on giving. And that's pretty much the summary of this episode, is to make it not so frightening to build your first cube or to expand upon your cube ideas, right? That's what we want here. We want everybody to come to CubeCon in 2023 with a brand new shiny cube with no fear, no doubts that that's going to be an amazing cube. And through play testing and iterations and evolution, it'll get there even within your own play circle, right? Your play groups. It'll get bigger, better, and faster. Other than that, we're going to move over to our socials. This has been a fun episode, and I want to say again, thank you for Christian for joining us. And if you love the episode, and we certainly hope you do, we would truly, truly appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite pod player. In addition, we've been recently selected as an affiliate for Inked Gaming, where you can find all of your custom playmats and dice bags, etc. We are so proud to actually be connected to such an amazing site. That's where we actually had our UberCube playmats drafted and printed. Other than that, you can find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod. Reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com. Or you can link us on our Discord, where we can have an amazing discussions. It's been just wonderful having that group in there. We talk about all things cube, to include pack one, pick ones, which cards you should add to your cube, etc. It's just an amazing, inspirational conversations that we have on a daily basis. Other than that, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to say, Happy Cubing!